Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 202. So today, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the Communist Manifesto. So we're going to talk about parts 3 and 4 today. So part 3 is basically Marx and Engels sort of critiquing the existing literature about communism and socialism, and then part 4 is about how they feel about communism on the world scale. So these two are a little strange, but don't worry, I'll try to explain everything. So, let's get started. Before we really dig in, I thought it would be helpful to go over a few definitions. Sometimes we kind of throw these words around casually, and the way that people use them is not always in line with what they're supposed to mean. So let's go through what a few of these things are supposed to mean. So first, communism. So this is a pretty good definition of communism. This one comes straight from the dictionary. A political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned, and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. So this is pretty good. Basically, the premise is that everything is publicly owned, everyone has some sort of liability to work, everyone is supposed to kind of pitch in, and then people are paid or at least supplied with goods in accordance with their efforts. So Marx's specific version of capitalism was very slightly different, but one thing that's important to remember is that he didn't quite finish his plan. So one of the things that we talked about last week was the way that he sort of laid out the structure of communism and then just stopped. So basically his version was that there would be two stages. Essentially the society itself would go from where it was then, with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There would be a massive uprising of the proletariat. The proletariat would take over the government, and then they would do some sort of socialism on their way to communism. So Marx saw it as kind of a process. Step 1, revolution. Step 2, takeover. Step 3, socialism. Step 4, communism. Again, it wasn't the cleanest plan everybody ever saw. Socialism, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It's kind of like a midpoint between communism and capitalism. This definition says, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. So again, we see the sort of like sharing of property, the sharing of the means of production. But within socialism, there is a little bit of private property as well. You certainly own your own house and you earn a paycheck, but a lot of it is angled towards the greater good. So it's sort of less selfish, but not all the way towards sharing everything all the time. Finally, we come to capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Central characteristics of capitalism include capital accumulation. We talked about the sort of like storing the wealth. Competitive markets, a price system, private property, and the recognition of property rights, voluntary exchange, and wage labor. So again, with capitalism, everything is owned privately. There's no more of this sort of like sharing. Basically, everything is owned privately, and in pure capitalism, the government stays largely out of the economic system. So this is something that we often don't see practiced, and one of the things we'll talk about this week is the way that often capitalism has a little bit of socialism mixed in, but the purest capitalism of all involves nothing more than like wage labor, individual rights, individual property, and the right to accumulate wealth. So here's a little chart to look at to help us make some more sense of this. And I didn't make this chart, so thank you, Byju's, who made it. But this chart says that basically they're dividing up the ways that we think about ownership and government and class. So in communism, there's no private ownership. In capitalism, there's total private ownership. And in socialism, there's some. Similarly, in communism, there's no class distinction. In capitalism, there's lots of class distinction. In socialism, there's some. So sometimes a good way to think about it is sort of like the three little bears. There's basically an extreme, and an in the middle. So one of the things that we'll do in class this week is like really dig into the differences between these systems and why some of them are good in some situations, some of them are good in other situations, and how we find that balance. So hopefully that helped, and now we can launch into Marx. So part 3 is called Socialist and Communist Literature. And it's kind of like a literature review, like you might do for a paper. Basically, they were sifting through all of the literature that had previously existed, and specifically all of the ideas about socialism and communism that had previously existed, and taking them apart. They throw a lot of shade in this part. They basically dismiss all of these other theories and all of these other theorists as part of proving that theirs is the best. So essentially, we'll go through these three parts. Number one, reactionary socialism. This is basically people reacting to the way that the world is changing instead of being proactive. Number two, conservative or bourgeois socialism. This is basically the socialist policy sort of thrown out there casually by the people who are already wealthy. And number three, critical utopian socialism and communism. So that's basically people who are trying to make a perfect world, a utopia, and why they think that may or may not work. So, you guessed it, let's go through each of them in turn. So we begin with the section on reactionary socialism. And this was, kind of a phrase they made up to indicate that people were reacting to the way that society was changing, but they weren't doing anything helpful. So it was like reactionary but not proactionary. And for Marx and Engels, they thought this was kind of lazy. So we'll begin with feudal socialism. And feudal socialism is basically the way that they think the aristocracy is reacting to what's going on here. So basically the way that the people who used to be on top in a feudal society are reacting. In order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy were obliged to lose sight, apparently, of their own interests, and to formulate their indictment against the bourgeoisie in the interest of the exploited working class alone. So Marx and Engels are basically saying the way that you pretend to support the working class doesn't really shake out. Like, it doesn't feel authentic. It feels kind of patronizing. Like, for you, the aristocracy, to say that the bourgeoisie are doing it wrong feels a little patronizing. So they go on to say that the problem that the aristocracy might really have with the bourgeoisie is that they're changing the structure of society. And any change could be dangerous, because if you're the aristocracy, you're on top right now, but you might switch to being at the bottom. So little did they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism, that their chief accusation against the bourgeoisie amounts to this: that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed which is destined to cut up, root and branch, the old order of society. So basically, again, they're not necessarily afraid of what's happening, they're just afraid of change. What they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat. So again, it's not that you have a working class, we've always had that, all the serfs used to do the work. It's that you might have made an angry working class. In the olden days, the serfs and the peasants never really rose up because how would they? But now they're saying these guys might rise up, and that is scary and that is dangerous. What Marx and Engels have a problem with is the way that this is kind of hypocritical. In political practice, therefore, they join in all the coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their highfalutin phrases, they stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry. So there's a couple of interesting things going on here, right? So number one, he's saying, yeah, you pretend like you're with the working class, but we know that you aren't. We know that you still benefit from their labor. And number two, falutin is actually its own word. The phrase highfalutin is not like a sort of a southern idiom or something like that. Falutin is a Latin word. And so basically seeing that in there surprises people every time, but that's what they're saying. That basically they're trying to be fancy, they're using this fancy language, but all they're really doing is sort of pretending to support the proletarians while secretly benefiting from all their labor. The other thing that some of the aristocrats are doing, which makes Marx and Engels pretty mad, is bringing religion into it. So for a lot of them, they were saying that the reason that they were so opposed to the treatment of the proletariats was because they found it un-Christian. And for Marx and Engels, they're like, no. Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart-burnings of the aristocrat. Ouch, right? Basically, they're saying putting a layer of religion on this doesn't solve anything. Like, you're just pouring holy water on your heartburn, like you're not fixing anything. And furthermore, they're mad that they find this incredibly hypocritical. Because they're saying, like, not only do you still benefit from this, like, not only do you leave church and then just go home and benefit from this, but also, if you really look at Christianity, it's pretty socialist. Like, Jesus had a lot to say about, like, wealth and spreading the wealth and not taking the wealth with you and not hoarding and taking care of the poor. You know, like, it was very much a sort of, like, all together in this situation and not a alone in your fortress situation. So their argument is that if you really were following the teachings of the Jesus that's in the Bible, you wouldn't say this at all. And this is an argument that's going to come back again, because basically, again, the teachings of Christianity are pretty contrary to the teachings of capitalism, so trying to get them to meld together is difficult. Weber almost pulled it off, but everybody else thinks it's not going to happen. Next, we come to the petty bourgeois socialism. And this doesn't mean petty like mean and catty, it means petty like small. So basically, this is like the middle class. These are sort of the artisans, the people who are trying to climb up the ladder and become the bourgeois themselves. But they're having some problems because they're kind of stuck in the middle. So here's what he says. A new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of the bourgeois society. So basically, they're stuck in the middle. They would like to rise up from proletariat to bourgeoisie, but that's a hard climb. So he says this might be part of why they're so worried. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of the competition. And as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society. So again, this is kind of like the mom and pop shops. This is like the people who are trying to be middle class, maybe even upper middle class. And what's happening is that they're looking around, especially at mass production, and they're seeing the future. So in short, here are a couple of things that they saw coming, which I think is kind of amazing. The disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor. If you make things, one at a time, handcrafting, machinery and division of labor are going to destroy you because they can make a million things at once. The concentration of capital and land in a few hands. Again, yes, it's hard to buy something or rent something if like only a few people already own everything. Overproduction and crises. Also yes. Sometimes we get so efficient with baking things on machines that we make too many. And then those things aren't valuable anymore, and then nobody knows how much to charge for anything. The inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and peasant. Kind of. Again, we'll talk about this in class, but it is true that the smaller shops are kind of going out of fashion, going out of business. The misery of the proletariat. True, they were miserable. The crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth. This is one of the things, right? The whole distribution of wealth being so unequal was the problem. And the dissolution of old moral bonds. Again, this one comes up every time. Every time, like, pretty much anything about society changes, people are very concerned about the old ways, the old morals, like you're destroying society. And so, essentially, we destroy society, like, every 100 years or so, but people are always worried about it. So, when they saw this coming, basically, the petty bourgeoisie were like, your machines and your division of labor is going to destroy our way of life. It's going to destroy our shops, it's going to destroy our income, it's going to destroy our rise from the bottom to the top. So their solutions were twofold. Number one, restore the old way. Just get rid of all of the factories and the division of labor and go back to making everything by hand. Number two, slow down the new way. Basically keep using machines because they are kind of helpful, but don't make so much of everything so quickly. As you can see, these were terrible solutions. So it's understandable that they wanted to sort of make society beneficial for them again, but the problem was we aren't going to go back to the old way and we aren't going to slow down now that we figured out how to be fast. So for the petty bourgeoisie, their thoughts about what we should do for socialism and what we should do for capitalism were largely useless because their primary concern was protecting their way of life, which was already going extinct. Next, we come to German, or true socialism. And I want to be clear that they called themselves true socialists, not that Marx and Engels thought they were true socialists. In fact, they thought they were doing a pretty bad job, and some of the sickest burns of the whole thing are in this section. So basically what happened was that this idea of socialism kind of was developing in France, but not so much in Germany. but that didn't stop the German philosophers from trying to bring it with them. The problem was they didn't think about all the other stuff. So, German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and beaux esprits eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated with them. So basically, they kind of forgot that in Germany, they didn't necessarily have the bourgeoisie in the same way that the French did. And they didn't necessarily have the proletariats and the social structure in the same way that the French did. So they said that basically, you forgot that this is a different place and the same rules might not apply. The work of the German literati consisted solely in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience. Or rather, in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic point of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, namely, by translation. So, it's a little bit hard to tell how sick a burn this is, but I promise this is pretty harsh. Because basically what he's saying is that they took these French ideas and just tried to stuff them together with German traditions. They tried to just put this hat on this thing that doesn't wear a hat. So basically he's saying, not only did you not invent this, you didn't even make it work. All you did was translate French into German and then act like you'd done something. So they were not impressed. Basically they were saying the only thing you really did here was just translate some French thoughts, and that's not going to cut it. I may not have sold that, but trust me, it was a sick burn. They end this section by dumping on them just a little more. With very few exceptions, all the so-called socialist and communist publications that now circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and enervating literature. So they're basically just putting all the German philosophers in a bucket and throwing it out. They're saying that everything that they have written is foul and enervating, and it deserves no more attention. Very dismissive, super mean. Next, we come to conservative or bourgeois socialism. And this is basically the socialism that the bourgeois class themselves were trying to sort of float out there. They were trying to suggest a workable solution. But it will not surprise you to learn that it benefited some people and not other people. So, a part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. So basically, some of them are interested in addressing these bad things. They want to look at these things and fix the parts that are broken, mostly because they want to continue living their lives. This is a slightly better phrasing. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. And again, this is pretty harsh, but it's understandable. If you were the bourgeoisie, of course you want to continue to be the bourgeoisie. It's the best roll around. So basically what they want is to keep things the same, but sort of placate the proles. Basically get them to stop complaining, get them to stop revolting. They don't necessarily want to fix it, they just want them to be quiet. So here's what he says. It but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bonds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. So again, change nothing except y'all start complaining. Which is an amazing solution, right? What if the people who were, being punished and held down just stopped telling us about it? That sure would make us all feel better. Should sound familiar, right? So he says, it is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. So again, the idea is, we, the bourgeois, are doing our jobs so that you, the proles, can do your jobs. And we're here for you. So again, classic, rich and powerful people just sort of placating the less powerful and angry people. They're not going to fix anything. They're just going to be listen, it'd be really nice if you would just shh. So, obviously, Marx and Engels, again, are no. That brings us to critical utopians, socialism and communism. So basically, these are the people who want socialism and they want communism, but they want it to happen in a really peaceful, lovely, utopian sort of way. Marx and Engels, again, not impressed. Here's what they say. The first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends necessarily failed, owing to the then undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as to the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation. So basically, this is a very good start. Like, we see where you're going with this. We would also like utopia, but the problem is you haven't developed your ideas enough yet. So like you're on the way. Like you're on the way to something interesting, but the reason it failed was because the world was not ready for that yet. So he says, since the development of class antagonism keeps an even pace with the development of industry, the economic situation, as they find it, does not as yet offer to them the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. So again, as like our abilities to manufacture things rise, our economic disparities also rise. And he's saying that they sort of go in tandem. So it might have been possible to fix this back when these problems were small, but these problems are so big now that your efforts to fix them just aren't keeping up with what's really happening. Then he says, the undeveloped state of the class struggle, as well as their own surroundings, causes socialists of this kind to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonisms. They want to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they appeal habitually to society at large. And again, he's saying, like, yeah, it does sound good. Like, you're not wrong, you're just also not right. That essentially, everybody likes where you're going with this. Like, all of us would like to live in utopia, yes please, but, like, you're not considering the reality. Which is what he says. But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. So, like, this part is good. We like the way that you criticize all the stuff that's happening. Like, that part is good. I like where you're going with that. But the practical measures proposed in them point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms, which were at that time only just cropping up. These proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. So, you know, it's like they're trying real hard, but they forgot some of the stuff that's really important. And again, the utopian part, I just wanted to sort of clarify. The idea of a utopia actually comes from Plato's Republic, which you might have read already, and it's basically like a sort of perfect world and everyone's happy and nothing is wrong. And so by criticizing them, by saying that they want to be utopian, they're kind of saying this is like wishful thinking, like it's almost childish or naive. So they're saying like, yeah, you're on the right track, but you just don't know enough to get to where you're going from here. So unfortunately, this one also fails. So that brings us to the final part, part 4, position of the communist in relation to the various existing opposition parties. So they're going to kind of circle back around and talk once more about their position and how they're sort of facing all the people who are opposing them, which was a lot of people. The communists fight for the attainment of immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interest of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. So like, yes, they're here in the moment. They're trying to take care of the immediate problems, especially, that are faced by the working class. But they also have an eye on the future. They're not doing this utopian thing. They're not doing this reactionary thing. They are active. They are proactive. And they are ready for what the future might hold as well. And also, they have everybody's back. In short, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. So even though your movement might be kind of half-baked, they still support you. They support every movement against the existing order of things because the existing order is bad and they want to make it good. Which brings us to the last line, and you'll recall that I said that the first and last lines are so good. Here's the last one. Working men of all countries unite. Isn't that great? So direct, so to the point. All countries, all working men, unite. So again, their basic position is, we are with you. Every single one of us is basically the same. We are all proletariats, and all of us need to support each other in order to make this a massive, cohesive, functional movement. So they're saying that, communism and socialism aren't just for Western Europeans, they're for the working men everywhere. But they are still going to have to unite. They're going to have to do that first part, which is the revolution. So basically, the manifesto is kind of a call to arms. It's basically saying, these are our beliefs. This is what we think should happen. Now help us. So, what we'll talk about next is whether that worked. So, spoiler alert, it's never really worked. People have tried, sort of. People have tried really badly, definitely. But the problem is, it's just never really played out, especially in its purest form. And there's two main reasons why communism has never really worked. And the first is that it requires a revolution. And we've just never seen a revolution on this scale. It would require, pretty much all of the proletariats all around the world rising up, and that just hasn't happened. We've seen a lot of movements that have bettered the lives of the workers. We've seen a lot of unions and strikes and improvements, but we haven't seen the kind of big picture revolution that they were talking about. The other reason is that this plan was super incomplete. We talked about this. They wrote the manifesto pretty quickly, and the final draft was not necessarily what they wanted, but there's a lot of holes in the plan. So, once you overthrow the government and now you're in charge, now what? What does the state mean? Are we supposed to have a democracy or a meritocracy? Is it hereditary? Nobody knows. They just kind of forgot to write that part down. So very often what happens is that we see a sort of bastardized version of this out there. So for instance, several countries have called themselves communist. They've called themselves socialist. We've seen some small versions of this that we'll talk about in a second. But most of what we see here is not actually what they meant. So basically, to be a really communist country would require the revolution and then the total change of government, and we just haven't seen that. A lot of the examples are really just sort of a mix of other things. So sometimes we'll have China that, calls itself communist, but is really socialist with a little capitalism mixed in. Or sometimes we'll see something like North Korea, which calls itself communist, but is very clearly a dictatorship. So it's really important to remember that what you call yourself matters. People can call themselves communist and socialist all day, but we know a dictator when we see one. And it's very important within communism that everything is equally shared. And if you look at a country and you can see that the leader is living a dramatically different lifestyle than everyone else, that's how you know it's not communism. So the fact that a lot of people, and a lot of men, have called themselves communist when in fact they were just dictators, has really cast a shade over the whole thing. Basically, it's given us this idea that communism is like a synonym for just a dictatorship. And of course it isn't. But it is important to note that of course we haven't seen a pure form. We've also never seen pure capitalism. We might be seeing pure socialism. That's a different story. But the idea of saying that you're doing something but not doing it is crucial. This is where your critical thinking skills come in. It's important that you be able to look at something and tell whether or not it's true. So again, this might work on a small scale. We've seen several people try to do this. Basically, we've seen farms that were designed as communes. We saw a lot of it in the 1800s. We saw it come back in the mid-1900s with the hippies. We'll probably see it come back again here in a few minutes. On a smaller scale, it can kind of work. But on a larger scale, it just hasn't. Again, in part because they weren't really trying, but also in part because maybe it can't. So that's our final question. This is the thing that we're going to spend a lot of time on. Why hasn't it worked? Can we do this? Would everyone have to believe in it to do this? Is it even possible to share? You'll recall that a lot of our readings talked about private property and how much we love private property. So it's possible that this just isn't gonna work. But trust me, we'll talk about it. So as always, if you have any questions, please send me an email, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about this with you. See you soon.